Well, welcome back to Our Nation This Week. My name is Faitine Grzeski, your host here with the News Forum. Online, we are still social distancing, but pretty soon we're going to be back in studio. And one of the things we're going to be doing is having interviews with every single one of the Conservative leadership candidates. But right now with me, I have Dr. Leslyn Lewis, who is one of those by Zoom, by Skype here. So Dr. Leslyn, first off, how's the campaigning going?
Well, the campaign's going very great, Faitine. We have exceeded all expectations and we have executed our game plan pretty much perfectly. And we are ready for the debates and moving forward with the final phase of, getting people out to vote in the final phase, getting them to put it in their ballots, fill in their ballots and send it in.
Well, there's no doubt that things are going to be heating up here in the next few weeks for the race. But in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of heat. So let's talk about the issue of the national management of the COVID-19 crisis as it has hit up against the race issue. George Floyd's murder obviously sparking outrage, not just in America, but right here in Canada. You wrote a letter to the Prime Minister regarding his participation in the protest, against racism, But this letter that you wrote, as I understand it, was actually in response to what you were hearing from Canadians. So first off, let us know what the letter was, what the response was from Canadians, and then if you've heard back from the Prime Minister on your letter at all.
Right. So, Faitine, it was really important for me to write an open letter to the Prime Minister to ask him to respond to the data that he relied on for him attending that large-scale public protest. And so many Canadians had written to me and told me stories about them not being able to attend funerals and, that they were missing their church services and that their children had to forego graduations and even some not being able to visit their dying parents. And so they've made a lot of sacrifices. And I think that it seems somewhat hypocritical for people to see the Prime Minister at this protest with thousands of people when they had to stay away from birthday parties and weddings and visiting their parents. And so it was very important for me to ascertain what his data was that he used to determine that a public protest outside with thousands of people is safe while attending an outside funeral isn't safe, because people really want to know and they want to make sure that the collective sacrifices that they're making for social distancing, that those are necessary, and they want to hold governments to account and let them remember that our freedoms are important to us. And if you're going to ask us to sacrifice those freedoms, then we want to make sure that they are done with good information, and that those rules are not just applicable to me as an average person, but they're applicable to everybody in society.
Now, your first national communication on this issue, flagging this hypocrisy, was actually to the Conservative email base. How many responses did you get back after you sent out that initial email?
Countless. I wouldn't even be able to. It was over thousands of responses, thousands of reactions. People were just really, really, overwhelmed that somebody is actually addressing these things, because so many people gave up so much in COVID. And, people with families, like, they're enjoying the time with their families, but people who live alone, it's very isolating, and it's having a lot of psychological impacts on people. And so they want to make sure that they're just not being taken for a ride, and they want to make sure that the Prime Minister understands that these sacrifices are something that he should take seriously.
Of course, very commonsensical. So you received thousands of responses back from your initial email. That provoked you to then send the letter to the Prime Minister asking for that data. What has the response been from either him, the Ministry of Health, or from Dr. Tam?
Well, we haven't had any response from either of them to date.
Okay. There you go. So charting this whole situation forward, we're going to talk about jumpstarting the economy here in a second, but I first want to start talking about the race issue. Of course, as the Prime Minister of Canada, I think most Canadians would agree that it was important for Justin Trudeau to make a strong statement that racism is wrong, that we need to continue to find solutions to stop racism in Canada against the Black community. Also, the Indigenous First Nations community has flagged this issue over and over again. Was it necessary for him to actually go to the protest to do that? Or, if you would have been prime minister in that moment, how would you have shown solidarity against racism while still acknowledging that you need to observe social distancing recommendations?
Well, I think that I wouldn't have done something so contradictory to what my policies are, especially if I'm asking the rest of Canadians to adhere to this policy. So I don't think it was necessary. Other leaders from, opposition parties also didn't think it was necessary. The prime minister is in a unique position. If he believes our country is racist, he's in a position to do something about it. He's the prime minister. Getting on your knee is not necessarily, it's a gesture, it's symbolic, but it doesn't eliminate racism. Racism and discrimination exists in every society. So, for us to say that, of course, it's going to exist in Canada too. We're not the only society on this planet that it wouldn't exist in. So the issue is that we, I think people who experience racism, they want to be heard. And so I support the protests. I don't know that they are necessary in times of COVID. I think that they are at risk, and that's why I've asked the Prime Minister for the data to make people know that even the protesters, that they may be at risk of more susceptible to the disease, to the virus, because they are engaged in that activity. So I do want to go back to not undermining racism, though, because it is something that we want to make sure that we fight against. And we want to also make sure that we don't unfairly label people who are well-intentioned and who believe in eliminating racism. We don't want to label people racist unfairly also, because that also does cause hurt. And so I think that what we need to do is we need to find a way to heal together as a society. And I do believe that the Liberals have hijacked the narrative, and many times conservatives find themselves responding to a false narrative. They start responding to individual racism and start justifying the fact that they're not racist and people around them are not racist. And that's very different than systemic racism, because individual racism deals with intent, whereas systemic racism does not deal with intent. And we do have incidences of systemic racism in the country. We should not hide that, because there have been French people who were forced to speak English. And that's why we have Quebec as a distinct society always struggling to preserve their language, because they know the history. They know that that there was an attempt assimilation of their culture. And we've also had that with the current Indian Act and the residential schools, and some of our criminal justice systems have, discriminatory outcomes when it comes to race. Dealing with First Nations outcomes and the Black community. And we know that if we even take a First Nations person, that person committing the same offense as a non-First Nations is more likely to be charged. When they're charged, they are more likely to, less likely to get bail. When they don't get bail, and they're more likely to go to trial. When they go to trial, they're more likely to be convicted. When they're convicted, they're more likely to get a higher sentence. That is a systemic outcome. That doesn't mean that individuals are prejudiced. And so we have to look at that, and we have to make sure that we're speaking the same language. And I think that's a part of the problem with the conservative narrative, that the Liberals throw out a false narrative and they run down and then just get swallowed up in it. So that's one differentiation that I think is very, very important that we talk about.
One of the things that drives narratives is the symbolic gesturing, right? Okay, so Justin Trudeau goes to Parliament, participates in the rally, takes a knee, does all of this symbolic gesturing, which he's very good at a variety of frontiers. But one of the criticisms is that there hasn't been any practical action, even in the few days since then. People were expecting, okay, surely he's going to come out with some kind of a statement of what we're going to do going forward to deal with some of the things that you've flagged there. So let's talk practical actions. We've got the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report that came out about a year ago. Indigenous leaders are saying, hey, hardly anything in this has been responded to, has been applied. We've got the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all the recommendations that came out of that. Most of those also not set in motion. We're giving millions, billions of dollars to international causes. The First Nations communities are saying, listen, we still don't have clean drinking water here in Canada. So maybe just give us one or two practical things that you would focus on as leader of the Conservative Party and or Prime Minister to really move reconciliation and restoration forward on these issues.
Sure, Faitine. I just want to touch on some of the pain in these communities, and I'm going to use First Nations women, and I'm also going to use the Alberta, Quebec and Easterner alienation situation as an example. So what we're seeing is governments politicizing discrimination and almost using it as a talking point for them to feel, or for people to feel, that they are compassionate about society. And we're seeing, for example, the Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women's Report has been out now for over a year, but we have not implemented any of the recommendations. And so we need to go beyond just debating the issue of whether discrimination exists, or virtue signaling and taking a knee, and really just stop talking about that situation and move on to doing things that can alter and fix the situation. The reason why we're facing a situation where a province is threatening to secede is because they are tired of talking. People have checked out. And so now we're facing situations when people check out because they're tired of talking about racism, or they're tired of talking about Western alienation. Then we see things like riots, or we see extreme behavior like riots, or we see behavior like the province threatening to leave the country. And, I remember one situation where I was watching TV, and I witnessed in Parliament people, members of Parliament, laughing in the face. I believe the MP was Shannon Stubbs, laughing at her when she was talking about Western alienation. And it literally brought tears to my eyes, because I said, imagine that she has been elected to give a voice to her constituents, and the response from the rest of the country is to laugh. It was just unbelievable. And so I really think that we really have to put in place some mechanisms to deal with issues such as discontent and Western alienation and, discrimination that we see. And although we have, the best country in the world, we still need to improve. We still can do better.
Of course. You bring up the Western alienation issue. Just yesterday, I actually got an email from a business person in Drayton Valley who does transport in the energy sector. And I just reached out and said, hey, how are you guys doing? How's it going in Drayton Valley there? And she emailed back probably within a minute or two. And she said, honestly, Faitine, it's pretty much dead. She said, people are leaving, people have no hope. And she said, one of the things that's been very difficult is that all of the aid for businesses during the COVID-19, aid with the aid package doleouts, she said they don't apply to us because the energy sector is seen as an essential service. And she said this, how could the government basically be sabotaging this industry and then turn around during COVID-19 and say this is an essential service? She was basically undone with the hypocrisy of that. So let's speak to the Western alienation issue here just for a moment, but also kickstarting the economy. We're coming out of COVID-19 potentially with $1 trillion in debt. If you were Prime Minister, what would be your area of focus in terms of reinvigorating the economy in these upcoming budget cycles?
Yeah, well, I think that a plan for improving the economy has to focus on our main drivers. And one our main driver are small and medium sized businesses, and so we have to look at practical economic solutions that will cut red tape, find efficiencies, also, simplify our tax code and provide incentives for small and medium sized businesses to do well, because they hire 80% of all Canadians. And I think that we need strong policies to grow certain areas like what you just discussed, Faitine, and we need Canada first principles and policies to grow the economy. The plan has to be a long-term plan if we're going to even think of even phasing out our COVID deficit. It won't be an overnight fix, and we have to change our current situation of being consumers, moving away from that and being more producers. And so we have to up our production. We have to encourage investment. We have to find ways to stimulate our economy, get people back to work. And that means that, we have to start supporting key manufacturing sectors, our agricultural sector, food processing industries. And then we have to look at some of the mistakes that we've made in COVID. And one of them was not having sufficient supplies to care for us in times of emergency. And so 85% of our commodities and ingredients are that we even have for medicines is manufactured and acquired from China and India. We need to change something about that. And we also need to change the way we produce certain products, such as gloves and masks. We have to start manufacturing them here and making sure that we are able to produce respirators, technology that we need here to deal with crisis situations. So I think that all of those things are very, very important. In addition to, we have to really start developing our natural resources. Currently our current selling potential for bitumen is 120 billion worldwide. We have to make sure that we keep up the production of our natural resources, that we do that in an environmentally sustainable manner, that we bring back investments to this country that were previously pushed away. And when we even talk about systemic discrimination, Faitine, when you look at policies like Bill C-48 and Bill C-69 that targeted Alberta and targeted those industries, you could make an argument that was systemic, that to target those industries with that legislation, that was a systemic targeting of the Alberta oil industry. And so, and there are other policies that are connected to farmers and fishermen that are also systemic. And so we have to look at, improving our country in all aspects.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that you've also flagged in terms of improving our country is just the whole issue of freedom rights, restoring democracy. You are really passionate about this. I've heard you talk about parental rights. I've heard you talk about the issue of misogyny. Why is this something that is front and center for you?
Well, I think that it's the core of everything. It's the core of who we are. We have to decide, Faitine, whether or not we want to be a democracy or whether we want to be a socialist system, because we're moving closer and closer towards that. And people are becoming very, very concerned. They're becoming very scared that we are undergoing policies that undermine our democratic rights. And even if we say that we want to be, a leader internationally, you can't lead internationally if your own house is not in order. And if we are devaluing our democratic process, if we are shutting down Parliament, if we are spending, without any checks and balances in place and without any cost accounting and doing a cost assessment of our spending on future generations. If we are doing those things, if we are, undermining democratic values, if we are labeling people when they're trying to have conversations and learn, then we are undermining our own democracy. And I believe in fundamental freedoms. I believe in the democratic values. I believe that we can have discussions where we disagree and we can test democracy. And I believe that the right thing will be done once we uphold democracy. And we have fundamental freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom from persecution, our freedom of conscience, upholding our family and as a building block of society, upholding the rule of law. And even now, more essential, Faitine, what I'm hearing from people is that there's a new freedom, a freedom to be able to earn a living. People are so concerned that they may not be able to earn a living one day. And that is the crux of our democratic society. That if we're not able to earn a living, then we're turning over our society to a socialist way. And so people have to fight. They have to fight for their country. They have to stop listening to politicians who give them talking points and give them policies that they don't believe in. And they have to fight for what they believe in, that this country is the best country in the world. And the only way that we're going to survive is if we stay united.
Well, I think most Canadians would 100% resonate with that. And so, you've talked about the importance of national unity. The reality is, all of these issues are bound up together, right? The reason we have some disunity issues is because of economic friction, the systematic racism, as you put it, or discrimination that's even been flowing through that whole conversation with the Western alienation issue. I just love how you unpack that. So let's talk about this. One of the divisive issues is the climate issue, right? You have a master's in environmental studies. Is there a way to move the nation forward in a unified way that will both stimulate the economy and also honor the fact that we value the stewardship of our environment? And what would be some of your ideas around that, other than just supporting clean energy innovation?
Yeah, well, Faitine, people feel that even the environment is being politicized and is being manipulated so that they could invoke a tax and not really do anything concrete to improve our environment. And so my policies are devised around economic development that is infused and complementary to environmental protection. So beyond innovative technologies, there are real policies that you can invoke to bring forth in environmental sustainability. For example, we have a large liquefied natural gas sector that we could use to offset global emissions worldwide, and we can develop our LNG and sell it worldwide. China still uses a lot of coal, and we can export our LNG to places like China, to Africa, African countries, different parts of the world. So this is something that Canadians can do to affect the global environment. Another big thing, Faitine, is bringing in just enabling legislation that will balance environmental sustainability with economic development, and not the type of legislation like a carbon tax that just goes after a tax. Creative legislation. And we also have some abandoned oil fields that need to be reclaimed and need to be restored. And there's a lot of work that Albertans will get out of restoring those fields, and they have the capacity to do that, and they're willing to do that, and it will really, really generate the wealth in the economy. And another thing, the final aspect that I would focus on is just the education. So people need to be educated on how to do things differently. For example, most people don't know that emissions are the biggest part of in the environment. If you can learn how to conserve energy, change even building codes to accommodate net zero building technology, so that you have like better insulation, that alone, just changing that technology, does so much for cutting emissions. And also, perhaps aiming to have a 100% plastic recyclable program. Teach people how to do that, and that will keep plastics out of our waterways. It will enable us to recycle those products, and it will improve the environment. Just something simple as that.
Well, it's fascinating, commonsensical, and also I'm hearing some new ideas in there, and I think Canadians are really ready for some new ideas on the environmental front. So thank you for that. Just for a second here, let's talk international policy. Israel, the only democratic nation in the Middle East right now that has both Jewish members of the Knesset, Arab members of the Knesset, and other. Would you be in support of relocating the embassy to Jerusalem as a symbolic gesture of solidarity with the nation of Israel? And also on the economic innovation frontier, obviously Israel is an innovative leader globally. How would you see Canada's relationship with Israel going forward if you were leader?
Well, I support the move of the Canadian Embassy to Jerusalem. And, with respect to our relationship with Israel, Israel has always been a strong ally. And so that is something that I would continue. With respect to economic policies, right now, to be honest with you, Faitine, I'm looking within. I'm looking within Canada. I'm looking at what we can do here first before I decide what we need outside, because we really have to devise a Canada First strategy. There are so many people that are unemployed within this country that anything that we can produce and it can be viably done within this country, that is what my objective is going to be first. And then we can look at, forging alliances with other countries that can produce things that we don't have the capacity to do.
Well, there you have it. Okay, Dr. Leslyn Lewis, one of the contenders for the leadership of the Conservative Party, possibly contender for the seat of Prime Minister in the next general election, Toronto-based lawyer, 3 master's degrees and a PhD. Where can people find you, Leslyn, if they want to find more about your policies and vision for our nation?
So it's leslynlewis.ca. That's leslynlewis.ca.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, thank you so much for having me, Faitine. It was a wonderful time to be here again with you.
Okay, so we'll be back in studio with the news forum shortly. We're actually going to be going live on broadcast nationwide, hopefully by the end of the summer. So you're going to want to be watching for future interviews with Dr. Leslyn Lewis, as well as the other CPC leadership candidates. Until next time, take care.